Hello, my name is Denise Spangler. I am Principal Backend Developer at Zoocha, and this is my first Drupal talk. Today I will be talking about how I used Drupal Commerce to build a custom accounts management system for the UN shop. First, I will set some quick expectation of what this talk is about. The first point is this is my experience of how I worked with Drupal to create this account system. And also, this was my first big project from start to finish working in Drupal 10 that spanned most of 2025 and is still ongoing with Go Live hopefully happening in about a month. What this talk isn't, it isn't the ultimate truth of how something like this should be done, but obviously I tried to use the best Drupal way to build it. And what I hope you get out of it, I hope you get ideas of new ways of doing things. And this is a demonstration of how one implements services, controllers, event subscribers with code examples that are hopefully useful and not too boring. The outline of this talk will be firstly the brief and why we use Drupal. Next is a high-level architecture, followed by going more into depth with the data structures. Then I will talk about the overall workflow, followed by a brief overview of the reporting. And then I will end with mentioning the challenges and the good things that have come out of this. So here we have the brief. The current system is a very outdated 1980s DOS system. I can't even really imagine what that would actually look like, but I imagine it maybe looks something like that. The new system that is being built in Drupal will serve as an offline invoicing system, which means the whole functionality of the site is within the admin section of the site. The main function of the system is to create invoices, and then we have various entities that we apply to these invoices, which are payments, refunds, and credit notes. We will also need to create a lot of reports. An important point to note is that the site also has a front-end facing shop, so we need to use the products from the current site for the invoicing system, and also we need to keep both of these systems separate and largely independent from one another. Why did we use Drupal for this? As I mentioned in the last slide, the client wanted to integrate with its current Drupal shop, which has thousands of publications and merchandise items, and we were also able to leverage the power of Drupal Commerce, Entity API, and Drupal's extensibility. Here we have the high-level architecture. Everything in the system centers around creating invoices, but behind the scenes, invoices are actually commerce orders. So I'll be using the terms invoices and orders interchangeably throughout my talk. Then we have billing and shipping profiles attached to these orders. And then, like usual, we have products that we add to the orders as order items. In the system, the payments are special in that they can be partially applied to an invoice as well as being split over multiple invoices. We also have credit notes that are associated with the billing and shipping profile that will apply credit to the invoice. Excuse me. Here's the same diagram as the last slide. Like I mentioned before, the invoices are commerce orders, so I created a new order type to keep these orders separate from the shop-facing orders on the site. I created new billing and shipping profile types because the billing and shipping have many different fields between them. Products are made up of 4 product types. We have publications and merchandise, which already existed on the site. Subscriptions are a new product type solely for the system. And we also have miscellaneous service charges, which are unique to this as well. It will come into play with payments and credit notes. They act sort of like adjustments, except I created them as a product type so they could be more easily managed and tracked in reports. Payments, like I mentioned before, are special. They are made up of 2 custom entities in addition to commerce payments. The 2 custom entities are payments received, which records information about the payment, and payments applied, which tracks where the payment was applied to. And when the payment gets applied, it also creates a commerce payment on the order. Refunds are controlled by a simple form, and that creates a negative commerce payment on submit. A credit note is a custom entity that creates a negative order item when it is applied to an invoice. So here we will go over how the workflow of the system works. First, we create the billing and shipping profiles, which can be reused for multiple invoices and credit notes. For these pages, I am using a simple custom controller so I can control the view of the page and also give it a unique URL structure. Here's a quick overview of some of the code that I used. What I've shown here is a basic controller, which mainly pulls in, entity edit and view forms and adds a couple of custom tweaks to the display. Then we have a routine file, which defines new URLs for the profile pages, a links.menu file that creates the links for the admin menu, a links.task file that creates additional menu tabs for the profile pages, and the module file that I use to make changes to the add and edit forms for the profiles using hook form alters. After we have created the billing profile, there's a button at the top to create the invoice from the billing profile. This button will take the user to a custom add order page. When we then choose whether we are creating an invoice or a quote. And to mention, a quote is a simplified version of an invoice that is informational only and nothing gets applied to it, like payments. And here we are using a controller for the custom page, plus using hook form alters to control what we see on the add order page, as we only show a limited number of fields when we initially create the invoice. Here we have the add order page again, and when we click on next, the order gets created in a draft state, and we have some new fields appearing. One thing to note is an invoice quote status taxonomy field that gives us the status of the order. Sorry, it's up there. So for a draft order, the invoice status is automatically set to on order. Once we click Generate Document, we can now continue with the workflow, and the order is either locked as an invoice or a quote. This is the in-view invoice page, and we have different actions that we can take. The button's down here. The Generate PDF button creates a PDF using the entity print contrib module. Then there are two buttons, Confirm Invoice and Cancel Invoice, which are repurposed place order and cancel order buttons. When we confirm the invoice, it turns the order from a draft into a completed order state, and then the invoice status is set to shipped. An email also gets sent out to the shipping profile if it's a digital product. The Cancel Invoice button cancels the order in typical Drupal fashion and sets the invoice status to voided. The order is no longer editable in both these cases. I have used some event subscribers in order to accomplish this. So here I'm using the Commerce order place pre-transition event. The code checks whether we have an invoice or a quote. And if we have an invoice, it updates the invoice status to shipped and also sets the user who confirmed the invoice and also sends an email if conditions apply. The next subscriber is using the Commerce order pre-transition event to check if the invoice or quote has been canceled, and if so, we update the status accordingly. Here we have a table that maps out the commerce state versus the invoice or quote status. Draft orders are either on order for invoices or active quotes for quotes. In the draft state, we can modify the entity. Once we place the order, the invoice gets set to shipped, or becomes a closed quote for quotes. And closed quotes I will discuss in the next slide. When we apply payments to a completed order that is an invoice, it either gets set to partially paid or paid depending on how much of the total has been paid. And we have partially refunded or refunded invoices depending on how much the total paid has been refunded. And lastly, when an order gets canceled, it gets set to voided for an invoice or inactive quote for a quote. So like I mentioned in the previous table, there is a closed quote status. This is when we have an active quote and we want to convert it to an invoice without having to recopy all the same data. I have used entity clone contrib module and used its pre-clone and post-clone events to update the values of both entities. So when we clone a quote, it creates a new invoice with on-order status and then updates the quote status to closed quote. Now on to the payments. Once an invoice has been confirmed, a payment can be applied to it. And the additional requirements we have is that one payment can be applied across multiple invoices, and the invoices can be partially paid. So we have two custom entities that allow us to accomplish this. So when the payment is received offline, the user records the payment received with basic information like how much is received and the method of payment. Then when we want to apply the payment received to an invoice, it creates a payment applied record. This records the details of the payment and to which invoice it applies to. When the payment applied is created, it also creates a commerce payment with a manual payment gateway for the invoice, so it can update the order total. And we'll see how this works in the next couple of slides. So here we have the payment received page with all the payment details. I've created a form which has an invoice ID field, so one can search for any invoice that is in a shipped or partially paid status, and on submission of the form, it takes us to the applied payment page. And so this is why we have a dedicated entity for the applied payment. We have two sets of fields that either subtract from the invoice balance, that side, or add to it. The column on the left are debt fields that will add to the invoice balance, and the column on the right will subtract from the invoice balance. This is all done within a form submit for the entity form. And also on this page, we're using a real-time invoice balance calculation using AJAX callbacks, so it won't let you submit the form if the invoice balance goes negative. Since the applied payment records an instance in time once it has been created, it can't be edited. Once you apply the payment to the invoice, you can see a couple things happen to the invoice. The status turns to partially paid or paid, depending on how much the invoice total was paid. And also, additional order items are added to the invoice using the miscellaneous service charge products if any of the debt fields were filled in. And then if you go to the Payments tab, over there, it will show you the total payment amount of the commerce payment at the top, as well as a breakdown of the applied payment fields at the bottom. And lastly, we have this credit note entity. It was described as a mixture between an invoice and a payment. So it looks like an invoice and also needs approval to be applied. Initially, I thought this was going to be the most difficult part of the work to do, but after I developed the invoices and payments, it was done in half the estimated time because I was able to reuse some of the same techniques. So we have this created as a custom entity, and then we use custom forms to apply the credit note similar to payments. And again, we're using entity print for the PDF. So once the credit note is applied, you can see it creates a negative order item on the invoice and subtracts it from the invoice total. And here we have a quick overview of reporting that was done. We have about 10 to 15 different reports. Most were done using use and use export, but there was a couple of big reports that I had to do. One report was the month-end report, which is a PDF snapshot created at the end of the month. It contains shipping, payments, and credit note summaries. It also includes 4 additional reports detailing every transaction, and it is all contained in one PDF. To build this, I used a controller to create the page itself, 4 views for individual reports, a service to generate the full report, a service that uses FPDI to merge all the PDFs, and finally a Drush command to run the generator service monthly. The main challenge of this work came in understanding the complexity and relationships of the system. The initial estimation of all the tickets took a very long time to work through. There were a lot of change requests and additional MVP requirements that came through during client testing as well. It was then found that there were discrepancies between the data requirements and the reporting requirements. For example, in a report, we needed to show the user who confirmed an invoice. I had tracked this event in a commerce log, but didn't have a field in the order entity. In the end, this was actually quite easy to do because we already had all the custom code we could easily slot this into. And also, initially, how partial payments were to be handled in some reports was not clear, as reports were initially based on the commerce order entity using views. But once we shifted this to the applied payment entity, the reports then made sense. And finally, to conclude, using Drupal Commerce as a base to build upon with custom entities has worked out quite well. The development time for the original requirements was under budget, so we were able to pick up additional requirements as the client was testing. And lastly, it was fun in knowing a system so intricately. This allowed me to produce some thorough documentation more easily. Any questions? No? Oh, there's one. Can't see.
Thanks very much for this. Amazing work. I would like your thoughts on the scalability of the system. I mean, how many users are actually working on it, and what would be the operational load if more users were using this as a back-end production system?
Yeah, so there's only, I think, a limited number of admin users that are going to be using this, maybe like under 5. And most, I think, of the invoices are going to be subscriptions that are quite pricey. So there's maybe, maybe a few hundred a year. So it's not, it's very small compared to the front-end facing shop that receives, loads of orders. So yeah, it's not big.
Do a slight plug. I've also got a commerce session at the end of the last session of all the things on Friday. And for the back end, for the scalability level of it, one of the things we ended up doing was putting everything into groups so we could actually give access control to different admins, to different orders to be able to do things. And we're only up to 5 different groups so far, but everything we've tried and done so far, we should be able to have quite a lot of, tens of different admins with lots of different groups with stuff going through. And I've done commerce projects where you've got hundreds of orders, thousands of orders going in on the front end, and that's also fine.
All right. That's it. Thank you.